Welcome to the History Nerds Night podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Erik Rebain and his book, Arrested Adolescence. All right, listen, if you are a true crime aficionado, and a lot of people are, the Leopold and Leob case is huge. It's about a Chicago murder. I won't go too far into it, but it's been written about dozens of places. And it's been written very well. Some are good, some are bad, whatever. But Erik actually found new information. I know a lot of books say, oh, we got this new stuff, and then it's the same thing you've read other places. Erik actually dug into a lot of stuff that is not captured other places. Fair warning, the new stuff is horrible because Leopold was a terrible human being throughout his life. Oh man, it's way worse than we even thought, and Erik actually has the information to bring to us so we know how terrible a human being he was all the way through. With that said, how about I shut up? Let's talk to Erik. Here we are with author Erik Rebain, Arrested Adolescence, The Secret Life of Nathan Leopold. Erik, thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Now, before we get into the book, you're working over there at the Chicago Tribune. What's that like? Like, that's one of the big papers in the country. Like, what are you doing over there? What's it like?
Well, it's interesting. I used to work in the building itself. I do digital archiving overnight. So when the stories are going to come out the next morning, it's my job to get in there and make sure they're online at the same time that the papers are getting to the newsstands. So my shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And so I used to work downtown. Terrible shift to work riding the trains that late and that early. But since COVID, I've been working at home, and it's great, honestly. I don't get to meet a lot of people, you know.
I mean, it must be tough going out for a snack at 2 a.m. in Chicago. I feel like you have to have everything on hand, right?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't feel safe enough to do that. Absolutely not.
Well, I did do some shift work back in the day, and it's funny how that's both fun and absolutely terrible. Because you don't run into crowds, you miss a lot of traffic and all of that stuff, but you also feel like a zombie on the weekends because you want to live normal life on the weekends. But no, I mean, you're sleeping till 3 p.m., 4 p.m., and it just completely throws you off. What do you try to do? Do you just lean into it and those are my hours and you're quasi-vampire, or do you try and kind of mix it up?
I do try to mix it up. I lived that life for a while, and it did not work for me. And now I also work part-time during the day for the History Museum. So I'm not able to live that zombie life. And what I've found that I'm doing is I sleep for like 3 hours in the evening, in like the afternoon evening, and then 3 hours after my shift ends in the morning. And that's how I live. You're
young enough to live like this, Erik. For people like me, that's hell. That is absolute hell. But good segue, the Gerber Hart Library Museum, that's where you work, right? Tell me about that one.
Yeah, so I volunteer there, and it's a little library, but they are focused on LGBT materials and archives. So I work there doing anything they need me to do, you know, going and boxing up donations in someone's house, processing collections, processing donations, working the book sale, you know, anything they need.
And it's been around for a while, right? I think I was reading it's maybe almost 40 years old?
Yeah. It's really been around, and it's growing.
So now you doing all of this stuff, putting everything away, museum and all that stuff, was it a dream to write a book? Is this just, you know, on your bucket list of I just got to get this thing out? Where does that come from? Or did somebody just say, hey, you know what? You have some time in your hands in the middle of the night. Why don't you write a book?
No, it was never, like, when I was a little kid, I used to write some fiction, but it was never really a dream of mine to write books. But with this subject, with Leopold and Leob, something happened. I just got super into it, and I kept reading the books that were out, and then I started doing my own research, and I kept waiting, and I thought, someone's got to write about the later life. Somebody has to write about Leopold. And the books came out, and there was nothing. They all just focus on the crime. And I said, if I want to read this book, I'm going to have to write it. So,
well, that's what we were talking about before we hit record, right? So you're in the Chicago area. I don't need to ask how you came across the story of Leopold and Leob, especially in Chicago. It is the trial, right? But what's your earliest memory of Leopold and Leob? When did you first hear about the crime, and when did you first start getting the details about everything around it?
Well, I'm from Michigan. So I didn't hear about this until my last year of high school. My teacher showed a documentary about it in class. I don't know why, it was English class, but that's the first time I heard about it. And I was fascinated. What's the motive? What was the relationship between these guys? What is really going on here? And yeah, I just kept picking up books and I went from there.
And you already said this, the story that you never got to see, the focus of your book is to go all the way through Leopold's life. For those who don't know, we'll talk about the crime in a second, but I was talking about this. This book has not been written. Leopold and Leob is its own industry. I've got to say at least hundreds of books, and they can be very, very good, but they do get repetitive. If you get deep into it, you get in a lot of the same details. But you saw that, the rest of Leopold's life, the murder is committed, he goes to jail, and then everything else is a footnote. What made you say, hold on, there's a whole nother book here just from when he gets to prison?
Yeah, it is fascinating. So for me, what really made me take notice, so I originally started doing my archival research. I was only looking at letters from people. He donated a lot of letters to a museum. And at the beginning, I was only going through letters to his family members, to people that he knew before he went to prison, because I was hoping for some details about his life before or the trial or anything like that. I was not interested in his later life. I was just looking for details, from the past. But as I was reading the letters, I got more and more interested in who he actually was. Because at the beginning of my research, I believed what I think most people believe, which is Leopold wasn't as bad as Leob. Maybe Leopold was kind of led into it, that he reformed afterward. And I was kind of seeing contradictions to that. Eventually, I found that was just absolutely not true. I couldn't believe that these fiction and even nonfiction books kept coming out saying, oh, he was a really good guy. And he was shy and he was a loner. And he was just so in love with Leob that he would just do anything, but he wasn't really that bad. He was just weak-willed or something. That was not the man I was finding in all this research.
No, dear Lord. Yeah. Listen, your book is very good. So before I say this next thing, your book is very good. Everybody should read it. It's gross, though. Like, he's gross and he's terrible. But let's backtrack, because on the off chance that somebody has never heard of Leopold and Leob, can you give me just a quick 1-minute explainer? Who are they? What happened?
Yep. So in 1924, Richard Leob and Nathan Leopold, who were 18 and 19 at the time, decided they wanted to commit a perfect crime. They pick a child at random. They choose a 14-year-old named Bobby Franks, grab him off the street, murder him, hide his body, do a very inept job, and are caught 10 days later. A huge trial. Clarence Darrow is their lawyer. They're sentenced to life plus 99 years. It is a huge media sensation. Just everyone in Chicago can't get enough of it.
And then the big piece here, especially for your book, that happens, you cover that, and then we get to prison. And like you said, what it seems to be the prevailing story is Leob and Leopold go to prison. Leopold, kind of quiet, kind of stays to himself. Leob is a bit more gregarious, kind of gets along better with people, starts putting together a school, a library, and stuff like that. And then, spoiler alert, but come on, everybody, happened 100 years ago. Leob is murdered in prison, and Leopold has to serve out his term. What did you find? Everything that I just said, how much does that hold up when you really start digging into it?
I mean, that part, for the most part, I would never call Leopold quiet. I think he liked the sound of his own voice too much. But for the most part, yeah, like Leopold and Leob, Leob was more likable, Leob was more gregarious. They both do really good, constructive things in prison. They're both involved in this school, the library, helping people get paroled and things like that. And then, yeah, Leob is murdered. So, like, that much is true. There's just a lot more underneath the surface that is not usually talked about.
Which is very strange for me. There's a juxtaposition here. Leopold, just people don't like him. He's just kind of a jerk, right? Like, forget the murder. He's kind of a jerk. Leob seems to be a bit easier to get along with. There seems to be some semblance of goodness in him. But, and you argue with me if you want, obviously you've read a lot more on this, it also seems to me that this murder of Bobby Franks would not happen without the two of them being together. But it also seems like the driver, because they were, basically daring each other to do bigger and bigger crimes. It seems like murder was Leob's idea. Like, that step was Leob's idea. So on the one hand, he seems to be the person who actually has some goodness in him. But then again, Leopold probably doesn't commit a murder without Leob. What do you think? How far off am I?
Well, the interesting thing is, because they wanted to commit murder back in 1921, 3 years before their actual murder. And that one was, I think, mutual. They both wanted to do that because, so Leopold and Leob had a sexual relationship, for people who don't know. And one day or night, they were walked in bed together. And the guy who saw them went and spread rumors about, or not rumors, just told people about their relationship, which was obviously very bad for them in 1921 when this happened. And they wanted to murder this guy. They planned it all out. Leopold also wanted to rape him as kind of like torture him, rape him, all this kind of thing. But they couldn't figure out a way to do that without people obviously saying, well, you guys would do it. Because he spread these rumors about you. So obviously you have the motive. For me, both Leopold and Leob lack a kind of morality that allowed them to do whatever. I agree. I think the idea of this ransom idea came from Leob, but Leopold didn't care. Like, yeah, sure, I'll do that with you, whatever. So whether they would have done this kind of thing alone, maybe, or maybe with someone else, if the situation had arose, if something happened where, we need to kill this guy to further our own goals, I don't think they would have cared. I think they would have done it with or without each other because they were just both terrible, amoral people.
And you talk about it. I haven't seen this in a lot of books. They have these lovers' squabbles that you highlight a lot more than I think a lot of other books too, which is, well, first of all, this Bobby Franks thing almost came together at the last second. They had stopped talking. They had a big falling out. And it's almost like the crimes were what pulled them back towards each other, as opposed to any real genuine, they talk about, the sexual relationship, which wasn't. And one of them was into it, but one of them was kind of like, yeah, just go ahead, but don't bother me too much. It was very strange. And it seems like the crime is what brought them together. Like, that was their thing that kind of kept them glued to each other, right?
Yeah, it seems like that's how they talked about it. Like, it gave them something nice to talk about together. It gave them reasons to hang out. I think they probably would have been friends without the crime. And even, without the sex, without the crime, I think they still would have been friends just because they both liked the same kinds of things. But yeah, I think because they did fight so much and they had all these, just this weird power dynamic between them, I do think that the crimes helped keep them together longer, or at least helped smooth their relationship over.
I do like that they are the perfect example of just because you're smart doesn't mean you're going to be a good criminal, because they were both, by all accounts, no arguments here, both extremely intelligent, absolutely terrible at crime. They just, they botched this thing from Jump Street, right?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know how they committed so many crimes before this successfully. Because it was a mess.
These are the types of guys that nowadays has been like, they committed the murder on camera. They didn't realize there was a camera there.
Yes.
Committed the murder on camera.
Yes, that's exactly, modernization, that's what happens.
So jumping to Leopold's in jail, and even before Leob is killed in jail, what you dive into, and it's just so clear from day one, the only reason that Leopold is going to get through prison is he is already a manipulator, and prison puts these skills basically on steroids. And even though, as we talked about, no one liked him, but he knew how to play the game, basically, right?
Absolutely. And he had a few friends. He did, he wasn't totally friendless, but yeah, most people didn't like him because he was an arrogant asshole. Yeah, he knew how to manipulate. He learned very quickly. The intelligence came in clutch there a little bit for him. But he learned, okay, which guards am I going to be able to bribe? How do I adapt? He adapted very quickly to the kind of code of conduct of the prison, which I think also helped. Okay, I can't squeal on someone. I can't tell something about another prisoner. He learned the rules, and that allowed him to play the game very, very well. Even if he was never as successful as Loeb, who did it more effortlessly just because he was more likable and possibly more nice. But he did learn how to get along.
And it seemed like Loeb never learned the real manipulation part. He seemed to be genuine in, building up, the school, library, all of that stuff. And it seems like his fatal flaw, which got him killed, is he thought he can just keep buying everybody off. And then when he wasn't able to, buy things for people, he didn't have anything to fall back on, and then he ended up dead.
For me, it's so hard to tell with Loeb, because for Leopold, I have thousands of letters. I've got his autobiography. There's a lot of people who remember him that I talk to. Loeb is a blank slate. I don't know really anything about Loeb. Although his death is very interesting, because we also don't know what on earth happened with that. There's the theory of the prison warden, which is that Loeb had been, supplying gifts to people. And when that money ran out, that got him killed. But I don't know. And for me, what's so curious is that Leopold was so sure that, again, sorry to get ahead of myself, Loeb was killed by this guy named James Day. And Leopold was not concerned about James Day, did not care about him, thought that the actual person responsible was Day's cellmate, this guy named George Bliss. And I have no idea why. I don't know why Leopold was so convinced that Bliss would want Loeb dead. What was the beef there? There are some people who said that Loeb had been trying to take some political power, and Bliss objected to that, or that Loeb was trying to go for, a kid that Bliss was interested in. But there's no explanation. It's completely up in the air. And Bliss died shortly after he was released from prison, so he didn't talk about it.
Well, and Leopold, as you said, this is his best friend, right? For better or worse, Loeb. And it is strange. Like, he just basically never blamed Day at all. It's just kind of like, he was just, even though he stabbed him all of those times, it really isn't his fault. In a bizarre story, just another bizarre detail, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, he literally calls him a tool. He calls him no different than the razor that he used, because he said another inmate used him as a tool. And I think for Day, he could have had a lot of incentives to do this to Loeb, whether if it was a personal grudge or not, because Day, he wanted to get paroled. He had a 1 to 10 sentence, so he could be paroled at any time. And actually, that almost worked for him, because when he went up to trial for Loeb's murder, he was found not guilty, and the judge said, I'm going to do everything I can to try to get you out of here. The warden shut that down. He's like, no, he has to serve his whole 10 years. He killed someone. So Day was in prison for a long time. He was in and out of juvenile detention homes for his whole childhood. And he had been a punk, or he'd been used for sex for basically his whole teenage years. And he was very young. He lied about his age so that he would stop going to juvie and would just get sent to the adult prison. So he was still pretty young. And he had a reputation around prison for being a punk, for being, the passive partner in sex acts. And I think he might have been sick of that. And he thought that killing Loeb would give him some status. And if that was his goal, it also worked, because he was caught sodomizing his cellmate about 6 months later. But that could be part of James Day. If Bliss did have to convince Day to do this, he could have said, you could, you can get some status. Maybe you can get out early. You can get publicity, And so I don't think it's strange. If Leopold did have a legitimate reason, if there was a grudge between Bliss and Loeb, I can see why Leopold would skip right over to Bliss. Be like, you orchestrated this. I don't care about this guy that you just talked into. He's just an idiot. I don't,
Well, speaking of using people, let's go on back to Leopold, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
So Leopold, as we talked about in the beginning, he starts to learn the system, and he's using people, and he's figuring out ways, he's teaching people, he's staying out of the way, and he's just figuring out the game. Where we really see just who this person is, I think, is when you chronicle his time as an older inmate. He's starting to think about how he can get out of jail, all the things that he can do to get out. But this is where you hone in on he's become a master manipulator. And I can see how some authors, if they weren't looking deep enough, would say like, oh, he's trying to give back to the community, he's trying to help out. But what you saw was something sinister. Tell me about Leopold when he's kind of a more seasoned inmate.
So when Leopold starts to get the first hints that he could get out, he just takes absolutely every advantage that he possibly can to look as good as possible. He starts trying to cultivate really positive publicity about himself. He makes sure to set up interviews, and he has to get the reporters to agree beforehand that the articles they will write will be positive. Otherwise, he won't talk to them. The thing is about Leopold, he did a lot of good things. He volunteered for this malaria experiment. He got inoculated with malaria, and he was a volunteer on the project. And he was really interested. He thought that was fascinating. But also, it was a way for him to manipulate people into having sex with him, other inmates. And it also looked really good for him to try to get out of parole. And he did that in every single job that he had. It was a mix of, this is fascinating, I want to help people, I'm really interested in this. Also, how can I use this to my advantage? How can I get people to have sex with me? How can I have power? How can I get better food? How can I get access to a private, whatever? It always went hand in hand. There was never any pure altruism. It was, it always was married with, okay, how can this help me get away with more?
Well, luckily the parole board saw through this the entire time and he never got out of jail. Right, Erik?
Yes. And so many children were saved because of it.
Oh, if only.
Mm-hmm.
It was a journey for him. He didn't get
it took
right
a long
out,
time.
But he pulled a lot of strings. What finally gets him out? How old is he? What does that look like?
It's interesting because he was building up his reputation for so long, and his family was also doing it too. I think his family, or some of them, definitely did believe that he was rehabilitated because he only let them see the best side of himself, obviously. And so they were all really pulling for him, and people who genuinely believed in his story, in his rehabilitation, started going to bat for him. And he writes very blatantly about, it's not about me. Let's tie this into something. Let's make it about, is it possible for prisoners to be rehabilitated? And if it is, then you should say that I should get out. And so he turned it into this thing that was bigger than himself to gather more support. So that did take almost a decade, but he did get out in 1958 when he was 53 years old.
One of the things that happens, he moves away, goes a little bit of tropical. Mm-hmm. And this is still just the hardest thing to understand. He gets married
mm-hmm.
to a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I could understand why he would do it, right? That's just something else to kind of cover up what we'll talk about next.
Yeah.
Why did this woman marry him? I still can't answer the question. I don't know what... It's not like he was making millions or something. It's just like he killed somebody. You know that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty well documented that you're not quite sure, what his sexual orientation is. There are rumors about which way it is and all of that stuff. So is that anything that you looked into and you could figure out? I still don't understand the wife part of this.
So his wife, Trudy, they met and they became friends. They met at a Seder, a Jewish Seder. And then they started doing fundraising together. It was all very nice and above board. And she said when she met him that he was unsure of himself, not that he was shy, but that he wasn't sure about talking to people. He avoided publicity a lot at the beginning. And so it made him seem nice. And he was working for a church organization. He was doing all these good things. And back in that time, homosexuality was often looked at as sometimes that's a thing that you do when you're a teenager or whatever, but you grow out of it, and if he's giving every indication, he's not what people would think of as stereotypically gay, he doesn't have any of those mannerisms or anything like that. It'd be very easy to just tell yourself, oh no, that, he grew out of that. He's fine now. Again, I don't know why being in prison for 33 years would make you think that he grew out of it. But it is hard. I don't know Trudy's motivations exactly. I don't know if she really did love him or if she knew that his family had money and hoped that he had a lot of money too, or if she kind of wanted the notoriety, because he was famous in a way. He was infamous. And in Puerto Rico, he was less infamous and more just respected eventually when he did a lot of his research work and work with the university. So I don't know enough about her to say, really. There's a lot of possibilities.
Well, the other thing that happens around this time is, I think being in prison for so long kind of it made this side of him totally impossible. And I don't think you actually say it sharply or directly, but he's a big freaking pedophile. He just goes full pedophile. And again, you see this manipulative side that he has just been honing for years, because he just keeps putting, and there are older men as well, right? So it's not just, purely super young children. There's also men that he's basically cultivated in prison who he's staying in touch with and still manipulating and kind of keeping them around. But I mean, he is just one of those terrible, terrible people that just see everybody who comes into his orbit is in danger one way or the other.
Yeah, it's disgusting. This was really kind of what put me on the path to writing this book, was finding this out about him. There's some things in the book from his friendship with a man named Robert Claiborne, who was another older gentleman in Puerto Rico who kept boys. So he had boys who worked for him on his farm, and Leopold would go visit and have sex with the boys. And one of these letters, I was just, flipping through, going through folder by folder like I did, and I was coming across these letters, and Leopold usually wrote in a way that wasn't super overt, because he didn't want, but Claiborne didn't, he just laid it all out there. And one specific letter where he said, one of my boys left, next time, can you bring a boy for me? And you can just leave him here. And he'll work for me, and he'll be here for your recreation. 14 to 15 years old. The poorer, the better. They'll stay, depending, if the worse their shoes are, the more they're likely to stay. And I was like physically sick reading that. And before then, I had really thought that Leopold had rehabilitated, that I believed what I had read. And this obviously made me reconsider everything. I said, I have to go back and reread everything, because a man who would associate with someone like this and would have sex with these teenagers and do all these things, this is not a moral man. This is not a reformed man. This is a sick, disgusting person.
I mean, I was pissed off. Again, I've read books on Leopold and Leob, and this part of his life is a footnote where basically a lot of authors, not all of them, right, but a lot of authors will talk about like, oh, he kind of rehabilitated, he ended up getting out, and he went to Puerto Rico and got married, and he probably wasn't all that happy because he's still a child murderer and everything. But other than that, he just kind of lived a quiet life.
A quiet life. Mm-hmm.
A quiet life, and you're like, not for the kids, like you're missing something huge. Mm-hmm. And you have this villainous person who really showed you who he was his entire life, but yet somehow just manipulated and knew how to use PR to kind of erase, just another awful part of his life.
Yeah, it's really incredible that he didn't seem to even get caught for that, for the boys, that nobody seemed to know what he was doing in Puerto Rico, which is fascinating to me that he could get away with that. But at the same time that he was continuing to do this, to molest these boys, he was, lecturing for the Philadelphia Bar Association. He was going on talk shows and talking about abolishing capital punishment. He was being invited to all these parties in New York, and he was kind of a celebrity. People really enjoyed him. They thought he was really intelligent and reformed and a great guy. And it's just the juxtaposition of what he was doing, what he was actually thinking, and what people thought about him during that time is so fascinating.
I mean, is it that simple that he was just better at manipulation than other people? Is there something that we're missing that he was able to so completely change his reputation? Or is it just that simple? Like he knew how to do it?
I think he knew how to do it, but I also think people wanted to believe the best in him. They wanted this to be a positive story. And a lot of people at that time, they were trying to abolish capital punishment. They were trying to show that prisoners could be rehabilitated. They shouldn't be just kept in prison forever, that people can change. And I agree. I agree that they can. I don't think Leopold is a good example of anything. And that is honestly something I'm a little afraid of. I don't want anyone who's anti-Semitic or homophobic or anti-prisoner to come away from this thinking, oh, he proves all these bad things that I thought about people. No, he is one bad person who did this one bad thing. He's not indicative of, everything else. But yeah, I really think he just played into, the best sides of people. All these people who wanted him to succeed and wanted to help him and wanted to show that they were, I'm a liberal person, so I believe that Leopold is a great guy and that he rehabilitated and, that kind of thing.
I can't help but think, and listen, I'm a huge history nerd, so I hate to do the what if. I can't help but think what happens if Leopold's the one that's murdered in prison and Loeb is the one that lives. Because, again, I don't want to talk up Loeb too much. He killed a child. But in comparison to Leopold, first of all, he seemed to not really be sexually active all that much at all. He was a passive part of their relationship sexually. And it seemed that when he did get to prison, the way they went about the trial, he seemed like there might actually be some contrition in him. I mean, you had mentioned he's kind of this blank slate for us, but from what you could see, was there possible redemption for Loeb in anything that you saw? Anything that makes you say what people wanted Leopold to be, Loeb could have been?
I do honestly think so. As much as I can say that without knowing a whole lot about Loeb, Loeb seems like a more normal person in a way. Like, even from the murder itself, Leopold had all these ideas of superiority and hedonism, and I'm allowed to do this because murdering this child is going to make me happy, and that's reason in itself to do it. Loeb did not believe any of that. He's just like, I want to commit a perfect crime. I want to do a ransom scheme, and I guess I'll have to kill someone so that they don't turn me in. And that's weird in itself, but it's not this whole philosophical thing that got stuck in Leopold's mind and never left. And for Loeb, he did seem, as what I've been able to find so far, he was more likable. He was more kind. He really cared a lot about his family. Like, everything he did in prison was, I've already hurt my family, and specifically my mother, so much that I need to do everything I can to, make her at all happy, to just prove that I'm living the best life that I possibly can for her. So yeah, I think it is possible that if Leopold had been murdered and that Loeb had gotten out, one, I think it would have been a lot easier for Loeb to get out just because he was more likable, more personable, but that he might have kept that up, that he might have just settled into, life. And I don't think he would have molested any children, certainly, and hopefully not killed anyone else. But again, it is impossible to say. But I think the odds are likely that Loeb would have been a better fit than Leopold.
All right, Erik, it's time for the question I know you're a little bit nervous about. I know you've been thinking about this one, but we found a History Nerd United because there are people who don't like history, don't like true crime, right? I don't know how to explain these people, but they do exist. If I sat one of them in front of you and they said, I don't like history, I don't like true crime, why should I read your book, Erik? What would you say?
I would say, what on earth do you mean by you don't like history? Everything is, we're living history right now. History is just the present in the past. Do you think that people are so different, with the past than they are today? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I would say that, it'd be nice to sell books, but this book is not for everybody. If child murder and sleeping with teenagers and all this kind of stuff is too much, skip it. That's fine. If you don't like true crime, this might not be for you. But I wanted to lean not into true crime, but a biography, which is more a character study of this one person. And if you are at all interested in the psychology of how such a weird, twisted person can become and what they will go on to do if you let them, and the kind of world that evolves around them that will let them do that, maybe you'd be interested in reading the book.
Well, hopefully whoever hears that will be interested. Erik, thank you so much for coming on. This was great.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode. Erik, thank you so much. Arrested Adolescence. Great book, people. If you're a true crime person, you got to get on this one. It's really, really good. Hit us up, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.